Bienvenido a The Talks, el podcast de la Fundación MOB, una serie de conversaciones con figuras imprescindibles de la creación contemporánea, un espacio para detenernos, escuchar y descubrir nuevas miradas. Gracias por acompañarnos.
Hola.
Hola.
Thank you for coming
Bienvenidos.
tonight.
So we're here to talk about Anna Sui in the 1990s. And we're going to start by talking about the 90s. And none of you remember this because it was a decade where there was no social media, no internet, no globalization of fashion. It was an era where you had to show up. And Anna can talk about her world in the New York in the 90s.
Yeah, it was so much more intimate. It was who you knew, who you would see on the street or bump into at a restaurant or at a party, and you would hear everything was word of mouth, or there would be posters, or sometimes you would see something in a newspaper. But mostly it was word of mouth, or somebody would call you on the phone and say, oh, there's a party going on. Oh, I'm going to dinner at so-and-so tonight. Why don't you come? And whenever you went out, you would probably see 10 to 20 more people that you knew. So everybody was interconnected that way. It wasn't like you went out and you didn't see anybody you knew. You always knew where to go, where you were going to see everyone.
Yeah, it was such a different time. You really had to show up for everybody.
Yeah.
And I remember Christy talking about in the book about how you just couldn't phone it in. You couldn't not show up. You had to really be there.
Yeah.
So you started your career in the 1980s, but your first show was in 1991, right?
Yes.
And I just want to read this one quote from the New York Times about your first exhibition. There was a multiple fashion collision on Wednesday evening. It looked as if Sly and the Family Stone crashed into Coco Chanel and then got rear-ended by Christian Lacroix. The show, the first by Anna Sui, was a riot. So that tells you something about where she was coming from in the 90s, in the early 90s in New York. So how did that first show come about?
Well, I had never been to the shows in Paris, and my friend Stephen Meisel, maybe you saw his great exhibition here, he invited me to go with him to the fashion shows. And the first fashion show we went to, we stopped at the Ritz, and we picked up Madonna. So she was running late. She came running out of her dress or her bedroom with her coat on. We jumped in the car, and the first show we went to was Jean-Paul Gaultier. But when she went to sit down, she took off her coat, and she said, Anna, I have a surprise for you. I'm wearing your dress. Now, I thought, oh my goodness. In her room at the Ritz, it was packed with every designer in Paris, racks and racks of clothes, bags of clothes, boxes of shoes, and I was so jealous because she had anything anyone could ever want from all the Parisian designers. So I was so shocked that she actually chose to wear one of my dresses, and that was one of the things that kind of gave me some confidence that maybe I could do something too.
That was amazing, an amazing moment. And she was wearing one of your baby doll dresses, right?
Baby doll dress, yes. Mm-hmm.
Amazing. So let's talk about the evolution of the baby doll dress and how it kind of really started. I mean, you said that you started producing those in the 80s. It was one of your first lines. But you went all the way through the 90s, and even to the present day, you still have the baby doll look.
Yeah, I always loved the baby doll look from the 60s on Twiggy and Jean Shrimpton, that little girl sort of dress. But what happened in the 90s, there were all these girl groups that were dressing in old wedding gowns or old communion dresses, chopping them really short, wearing them with combat boots and crazy tiaras or fur hats. And I thought, well, I want to make some really beautiful baby doll dresses. So the ones that you always see the picture of Linda, Naomi, and Christy wearing, that was my homage to that girl group baby doll style.
That was a crazy runway moment. I mean, that's one of the most iconic moments from the 1990s when Linda and Christy and Naomi collided on the runway all together.
Yeah, it was totally unplanned for. They did the finale looks, and Linda's the one who signaled to both Christy and Naomi, wait, just stand here. And so they all kind of turned around and faced the audience and stood there for a moment, and it became such a moment. And those are the pictures that you see everywhere. And with their tiara, their baby doll dresses, their metallic shoes with big bows. So it was just it just kind of set the pace for my fashion.
Yeah, amazing. And how did they end up how did you end up becoming friends with them? Like, how did they end up walking in your, like, here you were kind of like, it's one of your first shows, you're kind of an unknown designer, even though you've been around for a while. Like, how did you end up with these amazing supermodels in your shows?
Well, of course, my friendship with Steven Meisel really helped. And after we got home from Paris, he said, okay, now it's your turn. You have to do your own show. And I thought, how am I going to compete with what I just saw? And he said, oh, don't worry, we'll help you. And so he talked to Naomi, Linda, and Christy. They helped me get all the models. And then he introduced me to Francois Nars, who did the makeup, and Garen, who did the hair, because that was his team that he was always working with. And the rest was history. I mean, I think that it just was that supermodel moment. It was also the moment that New York became like a global stage. All the journalists, all the buyers from all over the world were coming to New York for Fashion Week. So again, it's like sometimes you just have to be in the right place at the right time. And I think that was my moment.
Yeah. You also tell a story about Linda Evangelista in Italy at the Vatican wearing one of your baby doll dresses.
Yeah. So actually, the story is kind of longer than that. We went to Valentino's 30-year anniversary, which was the first time I had ever gone to any kind of fashion event like that. It was all the legendary models from the 60s and all of the socialites. I mean, all the women had their own jewelry, their own clothes, and it was just like a heart-stopping moment to see Elizabeth Taylor dancing with Valentino at the party. And we decided for the daytime we were going to skip a Valentino event and we wanted to go to the Vatican, to visit the Vatican. And so we went there, and Linda realized she had on this baby doll dress. So she was smart enough and she brought some leggings, but then her shoulders sort of showed, so they wouldn't let her in. So she had to turn around and find a t-shirt, and then she kind of like draped it over her shoulders. And finally they let us go in.
It was almost tragic for her.
Yeah, yeah.
So in the 90s, with the baby doll look, you talk a lot about kind of how a lot of music influences, kind of the grunge era, the girls group. I know that music has always been a huge influence for you. And, you saw like Courtney Love wearing these ripped dresses, and how did that kind of work in with what you were showing?
Yeah, I mean, again, that was the other thing that kind of gave me confidence that I could actually show on a world stage. The fact that it was a seismic change, not only in fashion, but in music, in film. Suddenly there were all these alternative bands, and they weren't coming out of LA or New York with big producers. They were coming out of Seattle or Chicago and playing like colleges, and they were being played on college radio. And it was called alternative music. But the same thing happened with film directors. Suddenly they weren't the big Hollywood movies anymore, and you got like brilliant directors like Jim Jarmusch, who came out of the scene that from the 80s, the Mud Club scene, from the 70s, the music scene of CBGBs. There were so many creative people hanging out there. And it was so great to see people like evolving into their element and really making a difference in their arts.
Yeah, it was a really kind of creative period before things kind of exploded on the internet and social media. And you always went and saw a lot of music, I know.
I did. I went to see bands like every night for years, like because we had CBGBs, Max's, and then concerts too. So some nights I would go to 3 different venues to see them. And then eventually I became friends with a lot of the musicians. And we had like James E. Howe walk on the runway. And a lot of the models were dating musicians or the new Hollywood stars. So we all just kind of hung out together and had dinners, and they were all backstage at my show.
And that really inspired your grunge collection. There's another quote I just wanted to read about your grunge collection because I always thought that, when you look at the 90s and you look at the fashion of the 90s, that you were so seminal in so many looks and styles, but kind of you haven't gotten as much recognition for those as at that time. I think now finally you're starting to get that recognition. But the press said about this Swee's famous grunge collection, which honed in on the merging influence of Kurt Cobain on MTV and Claire Danes on regular TV by taking slinky striped sweaters and floor skimming dresses, worn with combat boots, of course, and cranking up their color saturation and ultra femme details like butterfly embroidery and glitter accents. And I think that really encapsulates your grunge collection. I mean, it was so unique and so it was so present at the time. I mean, you also talk about how that was the one collection that you did really kind of in the moment.
Because I was always looking to the past. I mean, my whole thing was I felt like I missed out on the 60s. So, of course, my first collection was very inspired by the 60s. And a lot of what I looked at were the 60s or the 70s or even Victoriana or 20s, 30s. But suddenly there was so much going on in the arts, so much music, so much great style was just around and on the street, and people were all shopping at the flea market and buying secondhand clothes, and it was just this moment that I thought this is perfect to do a collection inspired by all that.
Yeah, and Naomi Campbell was one of the first. She was really one of the first people to really grab onto the grunge collection that you did.
Well, what I noticed is, I knew Naomi, Linda, and Christy socially from Stephen. And we would all go to dinners, or they would come to my house, or we'd have birthday parties together. And they would always show up head to toe, Chanel, Versace, but I mean head to toe, right off the runway. And then suddenly Naomi was like, will you take me to the flea market? I want to get some of those old lingerie sort of dresses and mix it with my jeans. And there was another model making chokers. And suddenly I thought, there's something really changing in fashion, that this is really the moment when maybe it could be for me, and that it was suddenly for the models, it wasn't mommy's clothes anymore, it was clothes for their generation. And it just changed overnight.
Yeah, and it was also the 80s were, kind of those big shoulder pads and big hairdos and very kind of like Donna Karan bodysuits and
very power dressing.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. And it kind of was very structured, and this really kind of broke it all down, basically.
It really did. It blew it away.
Yeah, it was a seismic change for sure.
Yeah.
So let's just keep talking about music for a moment, because you had the grunge moment that you were inspired by the Kurt Cobains and the Smashing Pumpkins, and Christy also says that you and she had a crush on the same musician at some point.
Guess who won?
I don't know. But music has always played a very pivotal role in all of your collections. I mean, from the soundtracks that you have at your shows to, you had punk influence, glam influence, rock and roll. It's always been a big part of it. Why do you gravitate to music for inspiration?
I think, again, that was part of my dream. Was originally my first idea was just to design for rock stars and people that went to rock concerts. And it evolved very quickly from that, because when I showed my first collection, that's what I was aiming for, to sell these shops that throughout the US, every town had a really cool rock and roll store. And I thought that that's what I want to sell to. But suddenly I had all these orders from department stores, and then Barney's came along, and it just kind of evolved very quickly. So in my heart, I always just wanted to design for rock stars and people that saw rock concerts.
And you've always been you were really influenced by the Rolling Stones, and you had a deep friendship with Anita Pallenberg. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I never dreamt that I would be able to ask her questions like, where did you get those gold crushed velvet pants? But that's what I would do. Like I'd like hang out with her, and then I'd start asking her about her wardrobe or what she wore in performance. Or we would go to Portobello Road, and she would show me all of her favorite places that she would get clothes from. And I just learned so much from her and from her style, and realized that so much of what I loved about fashion really came from looking at the photos of her and the Rolling Stones and how they put their looks together, how they really broke down fashion, where they mixed in vintage, they mixed in tailoring, but it was kind of a alternative tailoring, and then how the Stones were the first men to wear like costume jewelry and their girlfriends' blouses, and so a lot of that went into a lot of what I was designing and styling.
Yeah. I mean, Marc Jacobs also cites the Rolling Stones as kind of a big influence. And they were so seminal in their fashion because they didn't follow the rules. The Beatles were wearing, the exact same outfits, the same little black suits with their ties, but the Rolling Stones, again, just kind of like blew it up. They were wearing scarves and mix match things, and probably a lot of it had to do with Anita and and Marianne Faithfull, their girlfriend. So it's interesting that you took inspiration from them.
And then I was so lucky to be able to ask them about it and ask them where did they get those boots and where did they get those shoes, and
And you designed some clothes for Mick Jagger.
I did, yeah. Actually, he was my first men's customer. Like I did. I think maybe it was my third or fourth show, no, maybe fourth show. And the first time I did menswear, and I got a phone call right away from his stylist, and he was hosting Saturday Night Live, and he wanted to wear the clothes that he saw on my runway. And so he was my first customer.
Amazing. It's great. And you've also dressed other rock stars. Dave Navarro, you want to tell that story?
Yeah. So there was a festival that I went to with my brother Eddie, and we were staying at the same hotel as all the musicians. And I came downstairs in the elevator, and the elevator door opened, and it was Dave Navarro from the Chili Peppers. And I was like, Dave Navarro. And he went, Anna Sweet. And we both ran different directions. And then I thought, that was dumb. Like, why did I do that? And so then that night, there was a big party in the tiki room of the Fairmont Hotel, which I don't know if anyone's ever stayed there. It's one of the last remaining tiki rooms, but it's so authentic. And you can imagine looks like a jungle with all these grass huts. And there's a raft that floats back and forth in this pond. And they play tiki type music. Well, on the dance floor that night were all these like break dancers, all these guys from the Chili Peppers, from every alternative music band, because they were all playing at this festival, and they were all dancing on the floor. And I saw Dave from across the room, and he saw me, and then like I went over and I'm like, hi, and he's like, hi. And then I said, would you ever walk in my show? And he said, only if there's lingerie involved. So that's how he got his lingerie outfit. Like I made him a purple lingerie top, and he had purple lace panties.
It's great. And you also did, your work has also been influenced by glam rock, and the movie The Velvet Goldmine and Iggy Pop, but you've always talked about kind of those collections as being kind of very upbeat, particularly your kind of punk collection. You didn't want to get into the nihilistic spirit of punk, but you wanted to kind of celebrate it in a different way.
Yeah, so again, I was lucky enough to be in New York in the glam days, and my favorite band was the New York Dolls. But when you went to see the New York Dolls, you'd always see David Bowie or some of the other musicians, the Stones. Like, people would come and watch that band. And the way they dressed, they, again, were wearing their girlfriend's clothes, wearing feather boas, wearing these big platform shoes that were made on the Bowery. This guy would cast them in this resin. And there's those famous platform boots shoes that David Bowie wore that have the palm tree in the back, and they're satin in the front. They look like 40s shoes, but they have this big, beautiful palm tree in the back. So they were all from Paradise shoes. And so the Dolls used to wear those as well. And I remember one day Steven Meisel and I went there just to look, and we saw David Johansen ordering a pair of the shoes. He was the lead singer in the Dolls. And then for the punk, again, I was very attracted to that music. We had a punk scene in New York, but I wanted to see the punk scene in London because we'd seen so many photos and read so much about the Sex Pistols and the Clash. And so the first time I went there, again, back in those days, you went to a venue and like everyone was birds of a feather. It was like the scene. And you ended up seeing all the major bands hanging out or somebody performing. And you got to see like all those people that you saw in the rock magazines all in one venue, like this, within like 100 people. I mean, it was pretty amazing. So when I started thinking about doing a punk collection, I didn't like the nihilistic quality of punk. So I thought, okay, instead of black, I'm going to do silver. So if you see that collection, all the leather-studded pieces are all in silver. And one of the big inspirations was Iggy Pop, and he used to wear those silver leather pants that were all studded. So you can see the influence when you look at the individual pieces in that collection.
Yeah, and would you say that music has been your biggest creative inspiration?
I think that music mostly, but also film, because there's a lot of influence by film. And I think that, I have the best job in the world. I can use anything that I'm obsessed about, and I can put it into the collection. Like when I did my pirate collection, again, I loved when Vivienne Westwood did her pirate collection, but I had also had the privilege of going to see Sofia Coppola filming Marie Antoinette. And so we went to Versailles, and they were filming the big scene in the Hall of Mirrors. And it was so much fun to watch like all these people that she cast, because they were all her friends dressed up in Marie Antoinette period clothes. And then, of course, there were the beautiful costumes that Kirsten Dunst was wearing. But at the same time, I went on a vacation, and I went to Turkey. And one of the first places we went to was a pirate museum for Barbarossa the pirate. And I thought, oh my God, this is the same time period as Marie Antoinette. That's what I'm going to do for my collection. I'm going to mix pirate with Marie Antoinette. So that was one of my favorite collections that I did, was mixing those two elements and combining some of the rock and roll elements with Marie Antoinette.
Crazy. What an imagination. And speaking of movies, I know another influence that you cite when you talk about your slip dresses was Elizabeth Taylor. And how you used to see her in movies wearing those kind of lingerie slip dresses. And another one of your seminal looks, I'd say.
Yeah, well, in the States, like every afternoon, they would play like old movies. So I and my mom knew all the old movie stars, so I would know their names. But one of the ones that I really loved was Elizabeth Taylor. And, I'd seen the pictures of her in Cleopatra. And then suddenly there was a new movie that came out, and it was called Butterfield 8. And in the newspaper, there she was wearing a slip with a mink coat over it. And I thought, oh my God, this is the most glamorous thing ever. So I had asked my mom for Halloween, could I be Elizabeth Taylor? So I borrowed one of her slips, and I had a fake fur leopard coat that my mom had bought me that year. And so I wore that with, those little plastic shoes with the little heel on with the elastic that little girls wear. So I had those in glitter. So I wore those. And I went out trick-or-treating. And we went like a little farther than what I usually did, just my block. We went an additional block. And I remember hearing about this house that was filled with bachelors. So when I rang the doorbell, the
Bachelors.
the man opened the door, and he's like, "And what are you, young lady?" And I said, "I'm Elizabeth Taylor from Butterfield 8. And he started screaming, and he brought all his friends. Look at, she's Elizabeth Taylor! Ah! It was crazy, like that they got the camp of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love it.
And so I had forgotten that memory until you were interviewing me and asking me about the slip dress. And I thought that was what started it in my mind.
I love it. That's so great. And when did you first start making slip dresses?
The first collection.
Wow.
Some of the what I considered evening were those dresses, and it ended up being an ad with Linda Evangelista, photographed by Stephen Meisel for Barney's.
Oh, right, amazing. That's a very famous photograph.
Yeah.
That's great. And those slip dresses have endured. I mean, for so long. I mean, now there's this renaissance with Carolyn Bessette and John F. Kennedy Jr. and she wore slip dresses, and they seem to be coming back in great numbers. And there's another story that you tell about making slip dresses, about kind of using some interesting fabrics, some Indian fabrics.
So another time I was in a taxi, I think maybe I had gotten my hair cut by Garen, and I was coming back downtown, and we passed Bergdorf, and I said, wait, stop, because I saw the most beautiful dresses in the window. I got out of the cab, I ran over to the window, I was so jealous, I saw this most beautiful orange dress, and I thought, like, who did this? What designer had, this great idea to do this dress? And then I read the caption, "This belonged to the Duchess of Windsor. She acquired the fabric on her tour of India." And so that gave me the idea that, I'm going to go buy Indian saris down in Little India Town, that we have like a small block in New York. So I bought these saris, and we made dresses out of them. And the most popular color was the hot pink one. And so many different celebrities were wearing that dress that summer.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's photographed quite a bit. Yeah. Another version. Are you still making slip dresses?
I am. And actually, my whole office is obsessed with the Zara slip dress. And for Christmas, I got them all the diagonal cut one. And they're wearing it with their jeans and like little tops on top. So we're all obsessed with it.
It's great that it has such a lasting impression, and celebrities still wear it, and young girls still wear it. I mean, it's just one of those enduring styles.
Yeah, and I remember in the grunge days, like always going to the flea market and finding the old '30s nightgowns, and they were so beautiful because they usually were cut on the bias, usually had some very dainty lace and flower detail. And now my nieces all love them. So like I gave them a lot of my old ones that I found in the flea market.
Oh, fabulous.
Yeah.
I want to talk about your kind of vintage influences, but first I wanted to kind of touch on, you also did this very seminal preppy collection in the 1990s with a lot of kind of current influences. You even dressed Lisa Simpson.
From The Simpsons.
From The Simpsons. You incorporated kind of like jazz and surfers and beatniks, and also there was a tipping point that you created with Hush Puppy shoes.
Yeah, growing up in Michigan, it was very anywhere USA in the suburbs, and most of the people in school dressed very preppy. And actually, probably like when I was about 12 or 13, I loved that preppy look. But there was a line called the Ladybug, and they did them in kind of brighter colors, like bright pink, bright lime. And I had like little sets of plaid skirts and cable sweaters. But then when I started seeing the things from London, suddenly I was changing my whole way of dressing. But I remembered all those things. And for this collection, I had Liberty of London prints, and I found some great plaids. We found this very, very cool faux leather that came in pastel colors, lavender, light blue, and butter yellow. And we made little cardigan jackets. And then I wanted them to carry lunch buckets, but they were in those same kind of colors. And we put I had an illustrator friend that did the cartoon on it. But for the shoes, I thought, oh my God, we need to have like some kind of really preppy shoe. And Hush Puppies were kind of a very preppy shoe, but they usually came in tan suede. So I contacted them, and they were just developing all these new pastels with the rubber sole matching. So we did lavender, we did light green, we did yellow, we did blue, periwinkle blue, Hush Puppy shoes. And we accessorized the whole collection with the Hush Puppy shoes. And Malcolm Gladstone was writing a book at that point called
Tipping Point.
The Tipping Point, and he said that kind of became the tipping point for a company like Hush Puppies, which had seen better days, had their heyday in the 60s, and suddenly they were the hottest thing again. And
Thanks to you.
Well,
So let's talk about one of your kind of biggest areas of inspiration, which is kind of vintage, and how you've always been to go to flea markets and really comb flea markets for a lot of inspiration. And why is that attractive to you? And
well, we had the best flea market in the world in New York. It was 3 different parking lots that were all like on the corners, and so you could go from one to the other. And when you went, it wasn't a matter of if you found something, it was like what you could afford to buy and how much you could buy, and making decisions like of what to buy. It was always great things. And I furnished my apartment, my store, and a lot of my wardrobe from these flea markets. But economics changed, and so all that real estate became too valuable, and they're now all apartment building corners. But what I loved about visiting the flea market, not only did it give you new ideas, but you also saw things that had been done in the past and were mostly created by hand. And I just love handicrafts, and I love seeing something that you know that somebody touched it, somebody actually formed that flower on it or crocheted that trim on it. And so to me, that's the most beautiful. So a lot of what I try to do is simulate that feeling too, and make it look like there's really a human that has touched it and really put love into it and created something.
yeah, and I think there's also looks from the 1940s that have particularly resonated with you. Yves Saint Laurent did a very famous show that was really it kind of bombed, didn't it? But those kind of looks from the 40s really resonated with you, as well as kind of bohemian looks, and another one is kind of like hippie looks, and you've always kind of come back to those sorts of things. And another one of your influences has been folk music, and Peter, Paul, and Mary, and Joan Baez, and
Yeah. So the folk music collection, I was trying to come up with a new concept, and I remember seeing pictures of Joan Baez, but she was wearing a Marimekko dress when she was with Bob Dylan, and I started researching and reading about the Newport Folk Festival when Dylan went electric. And I think everyone's now familiar with it with the Timothy Chalamet movie. I forgot the name of it. The new one that he just did, where he portrays Dylan in his village days. And I didn't know anything about it, but I researched it, and I had just moved into a new apartment, and by chance, my across-the-hall neighbor actually filmed those folk festivals. And so much of that Timothy Chalamet movie, when they show the concert scenes, are duplicating exactly what Murray's film looked like. So his name was Murray Lerner, and the film was called Festival. And I think he filmed like 2 different festivals, and you see Peter, Paul, and Mary, you see Dylan, you see Joan Baez, all performing under very, very lo-fi lighting. Like it looks like one light bulb above them, performing at night. And but the footage is so gorgeous because it's black and white and very, very kind of grainy and very high contrast. So I talked a lot with Murray about that, and then I said, would you ever let me run that film behind as the backdrop? So he made me an edited version, and that was the backdrop of the film. And all the clothes were very inspired by Marimekko and how I envisioned this kind of like East Coast college liberal student. And the models carried guitar cases, and they had like the little scarves tied behind them. We ironed their hair so it was really straight. So again, it was just very inspired by that period.
Yeah, that was a great collection. And you had the girls carrying guitar cases and
But we had them made. I met this guy that he was making model portfolios out of leather and then lacing them. And so I said, well, I bet you could make a guitar case. And he said, well, I could try. And he made the most gorgeous guitar cases. And then he made leather pants. And like I gave him kind of a basic pattern for pants. And then he made these great leather pants from it.
wonderful. Any other kind of vintage inspirations?
Yeah, I mean, we're going back to that 40s collection. That was one of my favorites when Yves Saint Laurent did the scandalous 1971 collection, because it was probably too close to World War II for a lot of people. And he was bringing it back and celebrating it where I think people had still wanted to forget it. But I love the fact that his inspiration was Paloma Picasso, shopping from the flea market or wearing her mom's clothes from the 40s, wearing the shoulder pads, wearing the platform shoes, wearing the turbans. And I remember going to the thrift stores in Detroit, and we had one that was on the other side of town, but if you brought a shopping bag from the grocery store, you could fill it for $5. And there were so many pieces of 40s clothes back then, still like in those secondhand stores. And so I would just cram as many pieces as I could into this shopping bag for $5. And I found some snakeskin platform shoes there. And yeah, it was a lot of fun to like dress up like that.
Yeah, amazing. So just kind of in conclusion, why do you think that 90s fashion resonates so much with the Gen Z and the current generations? Like, why do people crave that sort of fashion look?
To me, it seems that when this younger generation sees these images, it seems so real to them, because I mean, so much of what is done now is so influencer driven, where you're paying somebody to promote. And back then, when I had like these great audiences, it's just because I went to their concert and said, "You want to come to my show?" Or one of the models was dating like the new Hollywood star, or like the audience just happened by chance. This is pre-internet, pre-digital. So like all the kids now are attracted to those cameras, those real cameras. And back then, that was the camera that was the only camera that people would carry around. I think that there's a nostalgia for that realness and for that genuine and kind of more intimate sort of connection with fashion, with how you're dressing, with even like how your lifestyle is. And I think they all want to hear about those days, and they can't believe that there was a restaurant that you would go to and see like all these people all at once, and and rub elbows with them, or you'd go to a movie premiere and like all these people would be. It was just kind of much more intimate back then.
Yeah, and so much of your fashion has really, that you created in the 90s, is still so resonant with kids today, and they still want to wear it, and there's a big market for your resale fashions from those days, and you've been dressing some recent rock stars as well, Olivia Rodrigo and Dua Lipa, and again, they really seem to crave that sort of fashion from you.
Yeah, again, I think it's that genuine quality, and I didn't really even notice it until like a few years ago. But I have some great nieces, and when they were teenagers, suddenly they started raiding their mom's closets, and at Christmas they would show up in one of my 90s dresses. And it was so great to see the dresses again and see them on like a different generation. And they would like, "Auntie Anna, you've got to make this dress again. This is like the coolest dress." And like, so that started giving me the idea to go back and look at some of our old patterns and start making some things like that. But then we started getting phone calls from different singers and performers and asking, could they borrow archive? And that's always tricky because they're so fragile now. But sometimes we let them. And my niece Chase just wore some of our pieces from the 90s at Sundance. And that was fun to see her in
It's
the
amazing.
fall '98 collection. Yeah.
I mean, there was such a kind of rebellious spirit, there were so many, again, as you say, musical influences and artistic influences, and just like seeing people on the street. And, there was a lot of absence actually of photography, because either you had to be there, or, the moment couldn't be replicated. So,
Like it was very rare that you would get photographed by Bill Cunningham, but he was always on 57th Street. So, like, if you're feeling pretty good about your outfit, you would go up to 57th Street and get photographed by him, and maybe get in the Times. But there wasn't a lot of photographers out there.
Yeah, there was no proliferation of images, So I think that's why another reason that people kind of crave those looks, because it wasn't like an oversaturation like there is today. But, listen, you've had the most amazing career, 45 years, independent woman label. I mean, it's completely unheard of in these
Thank you.
days. So kudos to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.